can themselves transform themselves and their system within today's markets, and concluded, no, while it's more profitable to trash the planet, to undermine societies, than to protect the natural systems that we depend on, achieve climate stability, and have thriving societies, no, that won't happen. We need to change the rules of the game.
Welcome to The Sustainable Edge, your podcast that moves sustainability beyond talk. You get to hear sharp perspectives and leave with insights you can put into action. I'm your host, Joachim Nahem, and this podcast is produced by Position Green.
Welcome back to Sustainable Edge. Today we're talking about competing in the age of climate change. Is it about outperforming others or transforming the rules altogether? Are today's business leaders equipped for this new climate-driven era? And with us today, we have an eminent speaker who is going to take us through some of these questions. Lindsay Hooper, who is the CEO of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Lindsay has more than 20 years experience working with senior leaders from multinational businesses, financial institutions, and influential organizations to accelerate progress on a sustainable economy. Lindsay has also built the Cambridge Institute's portfolio of international education program, which now has more than 40,000 alumni. I think many of them are among our listeners. She has also helped develop senior leader understanding of the need to transform economic structures and markets. Lindsay speaks on global trends and the commercial implications for businesses, most recently on the need to align competitiveness and sustainability. This includes a paper entitled Survival of the Fittest, From ESG to Competitive Sustainability. Lindsay, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So lot to talk about, but let's start on this theme about competing in the age of disruption, which is a paper I believe you recently co-authored and seems to be very timely. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Thank you. A lot of people are asking about what we really mean by competing in this context, and there are three layers. First is really understanding how fundamentally the competitive landscape is shifting for business. The second is understanding what's really at stake. And the third is, well, what does competing look like in that context? And if we look at the fundamentals, this is no longer just about consumer pressure, stakeholder activism, where the rewards are around rankings or reputation. It's much more fundamental than that now. We're hitting really hard physical limits, so competition for access to resources. We've got competition for superior resilience in the context of systemic risks. We've got competition to dominate the industries of the future. There's, in a resource carbon constrained world, there's also a huge amount of opportunity there, and a lot of countries betting on dominating those industries. So a shifting competitive landscape. What's at stake is not just reputation, it's survival. Many businesses won't survive. There will be huge market disruption. So it's really understanding what's really at stake, not just for individual businesses, but entire sectors that will be disrupted. And then finally, competing in this context is recognizing that if a business only does what it can do within today's market context, if it only pursues the win-wins and does only what's commercially viable in the short term, we will all be at risk. So competing is about really proactively building the markets of the future, building those a commercially viable pathway to the future, and innovating and preparing to compete within that. So a focus on shifting markets and innovating and preparing to compete within them.
So what you're describing here is in many ways a dramatic context, right? If we look back a few years, it was more of a sort of idealistic approach in terms of wearing sustainability development goals buttons and showing commitment and saying, yes, this is threatening the planet, it's threatening people, but it was perhaps not the same existential crisis that we're seeing now in terms of companies literally going bust or having their supply chains disrupted, having employees not being able to have a workplace to go to, or a business industry disappearing perhaps. So it seems to be a lot more dramatic and a lot more sort of existential and self-interest at play here, not idealistic in any way.
Absolutely. But I think it's really important to recognize that the role of the private sector, role of businesses are set up to do what the markets expect them to do to deliver for their shareholders, their owners, and to do that within the bounds of the law. And they will do what markets require of them. So I think it's idealistic to expect businesses to do the right thing or to do things that are around to save the planet, doing their bit, when they're measured, they're assessed, the leaders within them, their tenure is dependent on their performance in markets that really values only financial performance. However, individuals, citizens are deeply concerned about the future, and there are a whole range of other levers and actions that are needed beyond a reliance on the private sector. But if the frame and the question is around what are the implications for business and how can businesses act, they need to do so recognizing the reality that markets follow value, not virtue.
And on that note, do the markets know how to value this? Are the incentives there? I mean, it's quite confusing, and there is obviously disruption to the markets as well. It's not just for businesses. Are they pricing this right? Do they really understand short-term, long-term implications?
Yes, absolutely not. And that was the report that we published, Survival of the Fittest, that was saying, look, we've spent 30 years of private sector action, well-intentioned, a huge amount of commitment, a lot of pledges, a lot of, I suppose, proof points, what I call the hero projects. Theoretically, it's fine. It's lots of things have been proven in microcosm. And there are places where the economics have tilted and where we have seen action at scale. But really, we're nowhere near keeping pace with the scale of the challenge. And doubling down more of the same is not going to get us where we need to get to. So I was really uncomfortable that, are we as an institute part of this? Are we perpetuating this myth that individual enlightened businesses can themselves transform themselves and their system within today's markets? And concluded, no. While it's more profitable to trash the planet, to undermine societies, than to protect the natural systems that we depend on, achieve climate stability, and have thriving societies, no, that won't happen. We need to change the rules of the game. So all of our work is ultimately laddering up to how do we do that, either through innovation, disruption, market making, or really targeted interventions to shift the regulatory landscape. We won't disclose our way through an industrial revolution.
So if we look at this from a training perspective or a thought leadership perspective, that you represent an institute that has had a lot of impact in terms of today's business leaders. We refer to 40,000 alumni. You are in many ways ubiquitous in our circles, in that investors, corporate leaders have this badge, as it were, certificate from your institute to show that they are qualified or insightful or have a skill set that for the past 10 years we've said is really needed in business. But what are you, if you took a course at your institute 5 years ago or 7 years ago compared to today, what are you saying that is different? How has this sort of changed in terms of what you are trying to instill as business acumen and understanding of markets and climate? What's different?
Yeah, good question. So 5 years ago, we were in an era where there was a level of confidence that, we were in what I now call the midst of an ESG hype bubble. So we had some level of confidence that there was political consensus, so governments were taking action, some confidence that even if we didn't have it yet, there would likely be future regulation and businesses should be preparing for that. And we saw positive market sentiment. We were seeing more capital flows. We were seeing more data on consumers wanting companies to be taking action and more sustainable products. We're now in a very different era. Political consensus are not just broken down. We know that we're seeing political attacks on action. Market sentiment has obviously faltered, not disappeared completely, but we've definitely seen economic headwinds, and we're not in the same kind of upswing in the market as we were. And there's so much more evidence that there are significant niches of consumers who are willing to pay a premium, but actually many care deeply, but are not able or willing to pay a premium for sustainability products. So many businesses are facing really hard market barriers, as well as some of those attacks on action. And because we've had this gap between, I suppose, society wanting and expecting businesses to take action, but markets not rewarding it, we of course see greenwashing, because you want to tell a better story that the world wants to hear than actually you can achieve within market conditions. So a lot of our work was very much then around purpose, and it was very much around what does great look like? What does really effective action look like? How are you really driving this through? How are you really transforming the business model? And our approach was similar to broadly everyone else's. Do your strategy, understand materiality, dependencies, set your targets, embed them, collaborate where you need to. There was a much greater emphasis on individual organization level action. We always talked about the need for wider action. Our focus is now pivoted. We have a much higher level focus on saying it's not that it doesn't matter what you do, but it doesn't matter if you take action, but all your peers aren't, because you're still exposed to systemic risk. And it doesn't matter if, I suppose, your UK or European sector is not acting, if China is, and they're going to outcompete. We need to look at the bigger commercial context. We need to look at geopolitics and how that's really shifting the landscape. We have to engage much more with systemic inequality, which of course is resulting in some of the very real barriers to progress. So our focus now is much more on resilience, on shifting markets, and on engaging with the real issues that are dominating leadership agendas.
If you were going to give some examples of this, some concrete examples of companies that embody these changes. So in the past era, if you like, if we describe it that way, in terms of the purpose-led, Unilever, a few other corporates, both leaders and companies, were mentioned all the time as embodying this, the values and the drive and how they were transforming business. What you describe now is a very different era, and still climate change, is very much present, more present, and has the same potentially adverse impact on businesses. But what corporates do you think are getting this right? What are some examples of companies getting this right?
Sure. And of course, this is the question that everyone asks and everyone always wants to know. And I always push back, as I will now, in some of that framing. Firstly, because we're stepping into the unknown and there is no, I suppose, kind of copy-paste example. People are going to have to move forward where there isn't always an exemplar. But of course, there's been a huge amount of innovation and practice, and we should be looking at replicating what does work and learning lessons from what's been tried and didn't work, of course. But I also want to challenge the who's getting it right. In an uncertain future, there is no definitive right. I think we're clear on what's definitively wrong, but actually what's right, we don't know. So we're having to make educated bets, and there'll need to be a huge amount of experimentation. I suppose it's like the dot-com boom and the early years of the internet. There will be things that are tried and don't work. And I think
that in itself could be an approach, meaning if there are companies who are honest about this and say, hey, we got it actually wrong, and we're rethinking this now. So because there is this dilemma for companies and investors, they seem to be stuck somewhere between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if they don't do anything, and if they renege or roll back commitments on sustainability, they'll be called out for that. If they stay committed on plans that are very uncertain or commitments that you're not sure you can meet, for example, on net zero, they'll be criticized for that as well. So they'll have activists on the one hand going after them for being, not taking responsibility, and at the same time, they can fall victim to this ESG bashing, be it regulators or politicians. Or investors. So sort of where, without perhaps naming specific corporates, but
I'm happy
businesses that are acknowledging this transformation and the need to be more honest about this?
No, absolutely. I'm really happy to name them. I just wanted to put some caveats around this. Like, we always want to know who's the hero on the pedestal. I think there are a lot of companies doing really interesting things, even if they're not necessarily getting it right across the board. So if we were looking through the lens of, I suppose, who's really driving this from a competitive framing and who's really working to create markets for the future? Of course, China. There are many Chinese companies who are absolutely, whether it's BYD or those in the battery space. So I think there are a lot there. When it comes to corporates, Fortescue, Andrew Forrest is very assertively pushing to really, make money, unashamedly profit from green fuels and so on. And he's working in really targeted ways around International Maritime Organization, for example, to say, where are the markets? Where are the rules that guide those markets? How do we shape them to give us a viable pathway for more sustainable options? Octopus Energy, disrupting markets through being very innovative. I think L'Oreal's doing some really interesting work through innovation in their supply chain, really looking at this through a very science-based competitiveness framing. And then I think there's some interesting coalitions, particularly in Europe. So I think the hybrid coalition between, I think it's a miner and a steel company and an energy company working together to innovate towards a future of fossil fuel free steel. Denmark has got a lot of really effective climate partnerships in the built environment, where private sector is working with government to say, let's have really good transition plans so we can confidently invest and innovate and know that we'll have market conditions that will enable us to do that on a commercially viable basis, doing sensible things in the right order. And of course, members of our corporate leaders groups who are using their voice and influence in support of positive government action to give them the certainty to invest. And some of the companies you mentioned, like Unilever, they have been really, I think, at the leading edge of policy advocacy and very transparent about their work there. I think IKEA, they've been heroes on those pedestals and have talked about purpose, but they have been very pragmatic, very focused, very assertive in lobbying for rules of the game that enable them to transition and remove the competitive disadvantage that first movers sit with.
And we've been lucky to have the former chief sustainability officer of IKEA on this podcast, who's spoken a little bit about these business models, including on circular economy, that seem to be good for the bottom line and also planet and people. But let me challenge you a little bit on those examples. They may be exemplars of companies, but the industries as such are not really being rewarded. So renewables as a sector is obviously down tremendously compared to fossils. The markets are pricing the value there much less than fossil fuels, even though we're saying in the long run, not by political design, but just pure natural resource limitations, you would think that there were more winners on renewable energy. But there are so many examples of sort of the market not really rewarding this innovation.
Absolutely.
China may be an exception because they can work a little bit outside of the market in terms of a more long-term planning and state financing. So coming back to the question of sort of how is the market going to get this right? It seems like it's confused.
Well, that's why it comes back to really our punchline is that in their own interests, to give them a commercially viable pathway to attract investment in, to be compelling in the markets, we need to change the rules of the market. We can't just rely on market sentiment. We have to take action that tackles short-termism. It tackles the fact that, as we've long known, externalities are not priced in, and we've got subsidies which still favour damaging activity. But the answer isn't just a really high-level silver bullet, pricing isn't going to be the single answer to this. We need really practical interventions at different levels. There'll be different intervention incentives needed for fostering innovation and scaling innovation. There'll be different incentives that are needed, and not just incentives, there'll need to be infrastructure, skills development to enable transition. And there'll be a different set of things needed for phase out of fossil fuels and damaging activities. So we need the right tools for the job. But it won't happen without private sector realizing that this is in their interests. This, rather than seeing regulation just as bureaucracy and always seeing this just red tape, to see this is going to be essential. How can they work with regulators to focus on what will drive real world outcomes rather than just requiring more disclosure, which is not leading to more. And that's a lot of what our work does with corporate leaders groups, working proactively with government to say, what are the interventions by governments that would shift some of those market barriers?
But how do you do that in a time of competing political agenda, geopolitics, electoral short-termism and other pressures on government to also not necessarily favor or prioritize green investment and green choices? There's a lot of pushback, and we're seeing this across the world. It's not just a Western phenomenon or a US phenomenon. So how do you sort of get to this virtuous place where governments and regulators work together? Because right now they seem to be not exactly working in harmony to put these incentives in place for investors and corporates to shift to what you're describing.
Yeah, no, it's really important that we're not naive about this. But unfortunately, the reality of the hard physical limits means that the science is on our side, and disruption is inevitable. The status quo is not going to happen. European businesses are already being significantly outcompeted in some areas and damaged and challenged because of the leadership that China's taken. So if Europe wants to position itself competitively, really be able to have a stake in the industries of the future, it's in government's interest to say, well, how do we nurture, support, grow, really build our strength in those areas? We do a lot of work around ensuring that an understanding of systemic risks is integrated into competitiveness. You can't be competitive if your soil is destroyed. You don't have the inputs that you need. So our work on competitive sustainability in Europe, which has had a lot of political and media traction, has been to strengthen Europe's competitiveness. We need to strengthen the foundations for that and be clear about where are the industries in which Europe can still dominate. Where does it have strengths, for instance, in resource productivity? Because we don't have a lot of access to resources, so we have to be efficient in our use of them. So sadly, this kind of global competition for finite resources will anyway drive this. The innovation coming from Asia to dominate industry of the future will drive this. Hard limits, the fact that insurance sector, as we know, is signaling a climate-induced credit crunch. We're starting to see more warning signs. We're hearing from the market. This isn't just academic analysis of the risks. This is now showing up in real commercial risks. So focusing on where are the tipping points or the intervention points, and talking in real practical terms about what the transition strategies are, not just all of the focus on high level goals. But we also have to recognize that the loudest voices that governments are hearing are often those lobbying to block progress, those that benefit from the status quo. So a lot of our work is talking to all the other industries. If fossil fuels win, farmers will lose, because you can't farm in the way we do in a 3-degree world. So it's a real competitive battle with winners and losers. And we're saying, don't be naive. The opposition, is lobbying really hard and assertively and having an outsized impact, and is starting to get much more public support against government action. So we need really assertive tactics to counter that.
And what is your view on regulators' role and regulation? Because you were saying we need to sort of get the regulation right and play with political actors. At the same time, a lot of the criticism when it comes to competitiveness and a European context is against the regulators. So the very influential paper presented by Draghi, the former ECB chair, who basically said Europe needs to get its competition act together, right? Because we are being outcompeted by the US, by China at every level, and we need capital, we need skills. And by the way, there's all this red tape around regulation, including on sustainability. And I think he was a little bit misunderstood in that he was saying sustainability can actually be a competitive edge, and it's important, but it should not necessarily come in the form of lots of regulation or paperwork and reporting, especially for smaller businesses. So in that context, what's your view on regulation? Like where does it sort of incentivize? Where should it step back? Where should it step forward? How does it help?
So I suppose that's back to my previous answer, which is we need effective regulation, not just more bureaucracy, not just more disclosure. We need effective regulation that will remove the competitive disadvantage that those that act sit with. We know all the businesses we work with would love to be innovating and investing and taking action. Their staff would love to be able to be doing that. It's the market barriers. It's all of those challenges that are highlighted, subsidies and pricing and infrastructure and having the skills. So it's about joined up government, but a lot of work needed, I think, between public sector and government. Regulators won't always know or understand what the real world consequences will be of a particular regulation. So I think it needs some quite radical dialogue and engagement around very specific industry transitions. What should be the use of finite public funds? What are the particular tools that are needed to address the particular barriers there, so that the private sector can be incentivized, entrepreneurial dynamism absolutely can be unleashed and harnessed. So it's much about being effective rather than volume. We need a level of transparency where you can't ever price anything if you don't have confidence in that. But we do have too much bureaucracy, and that's why we've seen a lot of backlash and a compliance mindset as well in many of the boards I work with. It's absolutely the level of compliance kind of gets in the way of real strategic thinking.
And what do you see when you're trying to coach or advise executive boards or senior management on these topics? What are some of the things they're telling you in terms of trying to get this across? What are some of the challenges they're facing? Obviously, there is a complexity in the policy and in getting strategy right. But are there other things they're saying that's hard in terms of speaking out, or in terms of, what are some of the sort of concessions they're making to you? What are some of the sort of day-to-day challenges beyond strategy and policy?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Such an interesting question. It really depends. Of course, it depends. Seeing a lot of people in sustainability roles, of course, being challenged, being asked to make the business case again. We're seeing people ask, which I haven't seen for a long time, is the science of climate change real? So there's been such strategic and disinformation that I'm seeing that being asked again. I am also seeing that there are a lot of businesses we're working with who it's just real market barriers, and they're facing real threats and challenge, reporting that in the past every investor asked them about sustainability or climate change, and this year none have asked them. And in fact, they're seeing it as, is what you're doing in this compromising your short-term commerciality? So real challenges of lack of market support for what they know they need to do in their own interest, which is really challenging. But usually when I'm being brought in, it's because they haven't got it all sorted. And usually I'm being brought in because they want to think about, well, how do they, build a strategy? What are the foundations of a strategy now in today's context? So what I see a lot is that actually they didn't have a strategy. They had targets, and they set them because everybody sets targets, and they do what they need to because their customers want them to be compliant, or regulation requires them to do so, but haven't got a real strategy about long-term value creation. They're dependent on market sentiment and their customers wanting it. And so some of the challenges that I see are a level of that compliance or do our bit mindset, that the strategy is not grounded in value creation and resilience. I see fatalism, kind of, well, what can we do? No sense of agency, and a real pessimism, which is understandable because we're not making progress. And then our challenge is, well, it's your job as a leader. That's what's the point of you. You need to be leading your business through this. And if you should be testing against a range of plausible scenarios. And if you think, actually, we're not going to see action, you need a strategy for a 3-degree world. So fatalism, complacency, see quite a lot of, well, the music's playing, we'll keep making money, and we're confident we can jump when the music stops, or whatever, the market tips. Sorry, mixing analogies. I think that's really naive. Even being a fast follower takes a lot of preparation. And the last one, may not be the last, but is naivety. And I see a lot of people saying, we're just going to sit this out. We'll see how the politics play out. We'll keep our head down in the face of attacks. We don't want a target on our back. It will bounce back in 3 to 4 years. It'll be fine, and see this just as a phenomenon of the current US administration. I think that's really naive. I don't think this is just a Trump phenomenon. I think this is much more significant. And if businesses are not being assertive in countering the lobbying and supporting the foundations for action, I think it's naive to think that somehow we'll just see a rebound in market sentiment and it'll all be fine. We can just, sit this out for a few years. So those are some of the challenges that we see. And a lot of our focus is saying, look, you know how to create value and be resilient. Apply that to these challenges. Don't see these as just compliance or a values-based piece. Really leverage your agency in your own interests and recognize this is a fight. Don't be naive. And the opposition are using unconventional tactics.
And what may some of those tactics be, or how do you use your agency? Because on this podcast, we've had this as a theme in terms of that we do have agency at the individual level as a citizen, a member of a community, or part of your corporation, and whether you're a sustainability professional or a CFO, father, a mother, etc., that we have this agency. But how do we then actually use this? What are some of the tactics? Is it raising our voices? Is it speaking to other people? Is it something has to change here as well? Because whatever is happening, we could, if we're going to be a little bit facetious, it's not working, right? We're not really changing. So what are we doing wrong here for those of us who have agency and wish to use it?
Businesses have so much agency, and I don't think are using it assertively, proactively, strategically enough. And our report, Competing in the Age of Disruption, has a really big focus on this. It's about focusing where are the realistic intervention points. I mean, there's no point going to the current US administration and saying, please take action, but there are some really targeted areas. Back to Andrew Forrest, he's focused on the International Maritime Organization as a very specific body that is making rules for a particular industry. So being really targeted about where are the places where actually you can get some traction. It's also about recognizing we can't rely on a small group of heroic companies who are all the same organizations that have done all the heavy lifting, and everyone is probably bored of hearing of them because they're always the ones at the front. It needs more of the middle. Well, there's a big missing middle of sensible businesses whose futures are at risk, who are not speaking up. And most of the speaking up on their behalf is through trade bodies. And they're not engaging really effectively in many places. Of course, renewable sector, but many other industry bodies are not engaged. There's much more focus on engaging and activating industry bodies, who are the ones that are often speaking to regulators. And Volans and WBCSD have just done a great report on tactics in relation to that. So equipping yourself with insight into what interventions, what places, who's influential. And we know from conversations with the EU and the UK, they want to hear not from the usual suspects, but they really want to hear from businesses that will support them to take action to a broader base. Requires giving some political cover to governments, because if all anyone hears in the media are businesses opposing action that are saying this is naive, this is woke, this is anti-business, it needs some counter voices that say, you know what, thank you, we need some certainty so we can invest. This gives us the certainty we need to do this, it's good for business. And the last, so just being quiet behind closed doors will not do that. We need to rebuild this sense of momentum. That requires also those businesses that have huge audience, huge consumer base, huge employee base, huge supply chain, to be using their voice to inform citizens and build a sense of confidence, momentum. This is happening, is good for societies. So to rebuild some confidence, momentum. If we don't get political and cultural support for action, we won't achieve progress. And businesses can be really influential in both of those domains.
And we're very fortunate on this podcast to have had some voices recently, CEOs of some significant companies, including Wallenius Wilhelmsen, one of the world's largest logistical support providers, and Stora Brand, a very large asset manager, who've spoken not only out, but I think been very vocal about why this is important to their business in terms of the mandate they receive as a asset manager is actually based on ESG commitments. It's about risk management, and also in terms of transporting EVs, and the entire business case there for decarbonization is instrumental to actually making money. So I think there are voices that are speaking up, but I think your point about SMEs is really important. They may be small businesses on their own, but put together, they make up a very large part of most economies. And we haven't really heard much from them, but I do know from experience, there are a lot of anxious business leaders out there who wish there were actually clearer rules and more incentives when it comes to sustainability.
I think a lot of the organizations and sustainable business community are increasingly recognizing this and realizing we need to address the fragmentation. Lots of individual voices can add up to something, but it's not sufficiently, I suppose, well organized. It's still too fragmented. I suppose the opposition, if I call it that, have incredible message discipline, incredibly smart tactics that are really aligned. So needing to be more joined up and have a broader base of voices and support that does engage SMEs and not rely on a few hero multinationals. So I think there's growing recognition broadly. We're part of that, but many others are also starting to move much more in this direction. But single voices can still be powerful. The paper by the board, one of the board members at Allianz, on the impacts of the risk of a looming climate-induced credit crunch is so powerful. That's one of the most powerful voices I use in our work. That cuts through in a way that many other things don't.
And interestingly enough, in this whole omnibus debacle, a voice or an institution that has spoken out quite clearly most recently is the ECB, the European Central Bank, has said there's huge risk unless we have understanding of businesses' footprint, essentially, in terms of emissions and sustainability risks. This has a financial risk as well that we are meant to monitor, and we need this information. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lindsay. It's been a really insightful conversation. And I would encourage our listeners here to check out the paper Survival of the Fittest, From ESG to Competitive Sustainability, and also Competing in the Age of Disruption. I believe these are both available on your website, and I highly encourage you to have a look at them. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Sustainable Edge. If you found today's conversation inspiring, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more sustainability leaders find us.